Hello, welcome to another screencast, and this time I'll be talking about the different kinds of body cavities, and I'll go into a little bit here about some of the linings of them. So by the time you're finished with this, you should be able to identify and describe body cavities and their linings, and then if you're really good, you should be able to put them on a blank diagram or model. And if you're really good, using that information to help you in sort of diagnosing or using them to interpret MRIs, CTs, that sort of thing. So if we get started here. So the organs of the body are organized into different cavities that are not open to the outside world. And the first one that we'll take a look at here is this thoracic cavity. And so the thoracic cavity, the organs that are there are the heart and the lungs. And also going through there would be some of the organs of the digestive system and the respiratory system, namely the esophagus and then the trachea as well. So this area on this the superior border here, the superior area is a little tight. And in order to look at this a little bit better or in a little bit more detail, if you look at this anterior view over here, you can see that this thoracic cavity, the inferior border of it is the diaphragm, and then the lateral borders are the rib cage, as well as the anterior borders, and then the superior border are the ribs, the rib number 1 on either side there. So the organs in that thoracic cavity, again, are the heart and the lungs, and the lungs are contained in their own separate little sac over here, which we'll talk about in a little bit. So these lungs are in this lateral part of that thoracic cavity. But then in the central part of that thoracic cavity, you're going to have the heart, which is in the mediastinum. So this mediastinum is divided into two sections. There's the superior mediastinum and then this inferior mediastinum as well. But essentially what is in this mediastinum area is the heart, as well as some of the great vessels leading to the heart and from the heart, in terms of the aorta and the superior vena cava and inferior vena cava, but then also, as I mentioned before, the esophagus and the trachea sort of will go through there as well. The thoracic cavity, again, is separated from the abdominal cavity by this diaphragm. So the superior border of the next cavity, this abdominal cavity, is that diaphragm. The anterior border are the muscles and skin of the abdomen, and the posterior border are the vertebrae. I might also mention, I did not mention up here, that the posterior border of that of the thoracic cavity is the vertebral column. So this abdominal cavity is sometimes also referred to as the abdominopelvic cavity, and these two cavities are sort of continuous with one another, and there's no hard anatomical border there between those, but rather sort of a imaginary line where the iliac crests here are going to form that superior kind of border to that. But typically the abdominal pelvic cavity is going to contain all of the organs of the digestive system. So you're talking about stomach, small intestine, large intestine, or the colon, and then this pelvic cavity has the reproductive organs, and then the last bit of that digestive system, or the rectum there. So the liver or the accessory digestive organs, such as the liver, spleen, pancreas, are also in the abdominal cavity. All right. So those are the main ones, and those are typically the ventral body cavities, right? So this thoracic and abdominopelvic cavity are the ventral body cavities. And then the dorsal body cavity is essentially containing the central nervous system, so the CNS here. So you're talking about the brain and then the spinal cord. And the cranial cavity is containing the brain, and then this vertebral cavity here is the spinal cord. So this dorsal body cavity is divided into sort of a cranial cavity and a vertebral cavity. But again, that cranial cavity is going to be continuous with this vertebral cavity. So again, that's the dorsal body cavity. Superiorly, the border are the bones of the cranium, not necessarily all the bones of the skull. So like the jawbone here and the nasal bones here don't necessarily form that bony border of it, but it's the bones of the cranium. And then the vertebral cavity, its border are all the vertebrae, right? So the spinous aperture there, or the opening that has the cord in it, right? So that's a quick overview of them. Another diagram from another textbook, but your textbook here again is identifying those body cavities, right? So this thoracic cavity can be divided into two, and this pleural cavity is where the lungs would be, and then the pericardial cavity is where the heart would be. So again, that thoracic cavity is going to be inferiorly bordered by the diaphragm, posteriorly by the vertebrae, and then anteriorly by the ribs and the sternum, and then superiorly by the first rib there. And again, that thoracic cavity can be divided into two other cavities: the pleural cavity, which has the lungs, and then the pericardial cavity, which has the heart. If you look at this abdominal pelvic cavity down here, the cavity that has all of the digestive organs in it is called the peritoneal cavity. So peritoneal cavity, and this will come in handy when we talk about the linings here in just a minute. So again, pleural cavity, pericardial cavity, these are sort of subdivisions of that thoracic cavity. And then the abdominal pelvic cavity is subdivided into this peritoneal cavity, and these are mostly the organs of the digestive tract. But then this pelvic cavity is going to have organs of the reproductive tract, as well as some of the urinary tract organs as well. So we can sort of subdivide those anterior cavities. And then not shown on this diagram is any of the dorsal body cavity. And again, that dorsal body cavity can be divided into the cranial cavity up here where the brain is, and then the spinal cavity down here where the cord is. Right? The cord would be going through those vertebral bones there. Quick primer on the lining. So the title here is that each of the organs of the thoracic cavity are covered by a specialized double-bagged membrane or sacs, and we'll go into this in more detail when we do chapter 4 with some of the tissues. But for now, just knowing that this heart has its own double-bagged or double-walled membrane or sac, and we mentioned this before, that those linings for the heart are called the pericardial linings, or the pericardial membranes. So there's a visceral one that is on the surface of the organ itself, and then there is a parietal one, which is on the outer part here, or the wall. So then there's a tiny little space between them that has a fluid in it, and the fluid in here would be the pericardial fluid. So from outside to in would be parietal pericardium, then the pericardial cavity, then the visceral pericardium. And so this visceral and parietal pattern will also hold for when we talk about the lungs, or these pleural cavities here. So here is the pericardial cavity, and this white space that's right in there, that's where the pericardial fluid would be. But then in the right lung and the left lung, those are also going to be surrounded by a double-bagged or double-walled membrane, and those membranes are the pleural membranes. And so again, you're going to have, from outside to in, you're going to have a parietal one, and then you're going to have a space, and then you're going to have a visceral one. So here they're showing you this pleural cavity, and there would be pleural fluid in there. So the parietal one, they're labeling it for you here, and I don't believe that they label the visceral one, but that would be the line that's right there between the black line between that blue and the white area right there that I'm trying to trace. So those are the membranes that surround the again, the heart are the pericardial membranes, and then the ones around the lungs are the pleural membranes. Then when we move into the abdominal pelvic cavity, the membranes there are called the peritoneal membranes. So here's the peritoneum, and again, from the outside to the end, the parietal one, and then you're going to have a visceral peritoneum, and then there will be this peritoneal cavity that is containing peritoneal fluid. Right? And this gets a little confusing, but for now, just know that you have, again, the same pattern from outside to in is a parietal, then there's a space or a cavity, and then there's the visceral. And in this case, this is the peritoneum, or peritoneal membranes. Right? And then the dorsal body cavity contains that central nervous system. So this is sort of just another way to visualize that, is that when we were this early embryo, the early embryo here, this was our nervous tissue, and so this nervous tissue you're going to see is going to be separated from everything else. So this is going to be like become the opening to our mouth, and so our digestive and respiratory tracts, and then digestive tract here, and then everything else is going to be digestive tract there. So you can see that this nervous tissue is going to be separate from those other cavities. So this is where we get that dorsal body cavity from. And the specialized membranes or sacs around the brain and the spinal cord there's more than one, but one that you may have heard of is the Dura Mater, and this is one of the Meninges. So the Meninges are the name for all these different layers of tissue that surround the brain. And so as you go from outside to in, you're going to have the Dura Mater, and then you would have this arachnoid mater, and then the pia mater. So there are three of these Meninges, which is different than say like the heart or the lungs or the abdominal organs, where there are only two. So the parietal and the visceral. Here in the Meninges, there are three layers, and those layers are continuous around the brain and then all the way down the cord. So if we look at this cross section here through the cord, you'd be able to see those layers as well right there. So this is the cord, and then there's going to be a space, and the space that's in the fluid that's in that space is the CSF, or the Cerebrospinal Fluid. And so that fluid is going to be like the pericardial fluid, is going to be like the pleural fluid, is going to be like the peritoneal fluid, except it's going to be different because it's going to be surrounding the brain and the spinal cord. This is just another image of sort of the same thing. How you see here's the brain itself, and then there are these layers or these spaces in here, and here where that CSF is going to be, and that cerebrospinal fluid, again, it would be analogous to the peritoneal fluid, the pleural fluid, or the pericardial fluid. And some bonus coverage here. There are some organs, and again, this gets a little bit more complex, but there are some organs that are actually in that abdominal pelvic cavity that are not in the within that peritoneum, and so they are referred to as retroperitoneal. And again, here you see, so this would be the urinary bladder down here, and that is actually not in this peritoneal cavity here, but more on that later on other videos. So okay, so I hope that you are able to sort of pause, maybe go back and review, and then be able to identify and describe those body cavities and the linings, and maybe identify them on a blank diagram, and then use that information when we start looking at MRIs and CTs, etc. So okay, thanks for listening. If you have any questions, then feel free to bring them to class or off